Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Bree Buonomo. Hi if you're new here, or hey if you've been here before. Today I'm going to be doing a tag that I was tagged in a very long time ago. I was tagged by the absolutely wonderful Madeline Monaghan to talk about my novel story ideas. Let's just jump into all of the novel ideas that I have currently in my head. Next, I have two projects that are in the process of being drafted and are not done in any of the sense. The first one I worked on for NaNoWriMo 2020, and that is my mermaid story, which is a crossover between a Little Mermaid retelling and a Hunger Games novel set in a dark adult world. So this is intended to be a dark fantasy and adult because there are mentions of graphic violence and sex on the page. This is following a younger mermaid, and now mermaids in this world do live like about 500 years. So when I say younger, really she's like 120 something. So it follows her as she is given an impossible task, as well as all of her sisters, and they pretty much have to figure out how to complete their task. And it's kind of impossible because the odds are stacked against them because they're likely going to die if they try to complete this task. But the whole purpose is set up that if you're able to complete it, then you earn your seat on the throne. So my main character is sent to kill a prince of the Land Kingdom because she once let him go in a shipwreck. So she has to try to seduce him to come back into the water to drown him, even though since that shipwreck happened, he has never set foot on a boat again. So that is my story. I was having so much fun drafting it. Hopefully I will finish that this year. I don't know where it's going to go, but I really like what I've written so far. The other novel that's currently being written is my adult satire novel, which I did also start for NaNoWriMo 2020, but I only got about 10,000 words, and then I shifted to the mermaid project more fully. So this one is super easy. It's just essentially a play on the chosen one trope, where the chosen one kind of, lives in all this grandeur until her moment of being the chosen one arrives and realizes that she's no longer the chosen one and someone else steals that title from her, but she is sent to aid this person to be the chosen one. So it's just kind of like it's supposed to be a fun, satirical, great time novel where you have a lot of the classic like tropes from epic fantasy, such as like a group of unsuspecting people coming together to be allies. You have like the epic tale of traveling to go do a quest, and nothing ever goes the way it's supposed to go. All right, so those are all the ones that are kind of in progress. And now I'll dive into some of the stories that I just have on my list. The first one came through a dream. As cliche as that sounds, I don't really have it fleshed out. That's why it's kind of just in this little limbo area. But it was kind of an idea of like one couple who tried to overthrow like the elders for their power, but they failed. So they start doing like a magic trafficking for finding potential girls to regain their own power because they lost all the magic. So they start trafficking people for their magic. I don't really know what I would really make this story into, other than the really big aspect that I had kind of in mind was this whole idea of magic trafficking. So yeah, that's really all I got for that one. The next one is also one of these stupid dream ideas that I came up, and I was like, this dream in particular though was so intense, and I don't know what I actually wanted it to be, but I've been dubbing this my Merlin story, but not really Merlin. So it won't be like a retelling or anything, but I have this idea for a character who would be Merlin. And he has a nephew, and they like kind of travel around. He's, supposed to be like the best wizard of all time, but it's kind of like a dick and everyone knows it. But like no one really bothers him because he is so powerful. And we have like this whole society of like these ancients, and they are the holders of marks that grant people power. So you have to be dead to hold this power. So basically that's why they're ancients. I don't know. I don't even know if I'm going to explain this well enough. This was the coolest idea I think I've had personally, but so basically an ancient is created when marks sense that someone can add more wisdom than the current holder, and when someone is supposed to die, upon their death, like the mark finds them and grants them a sort of limbo immortality until the next mark is chosen. So basically you die, but upon your death, before like you take your last breath, this mark is kind of like sentient and it like lands upon you. So then the mortal that was there that had this power is now like they pass on, and you are granted in this limbo stasis. And like it's almost like this all-knowing mark, right? So that you have like all this wisdom and all this power, and like you preserve it, and like you pass on for generations, so that magic continues to grow and flourish and always be ever changing based on all these people who have the marks. I personally love this idea. I think it's, like I said, the coolest thing I've ever created in my head. So basically, the whole idea of this story would be that an ancient is going to move on. So the mark is supposed to find its target, but the mark goes to a girl who doesn't actually die. So she still remains alive and ends up, like whatever case is, ends up colliding with this like wizard and his nephew. And they all hate each other, but they have to work together to figure out like what's going on, like why this fluke happened. So yeah, so that's my Merlin story, like I said. So my next story I've also had in my head for quite some time, and originally this was the story that I was going to write in NaNoWriMo 2020, and that would be my horror fantasy. So the idea is that I had a woman who's kind of like, she's in her like 20s at this point and is just kind of living a jaded life. When she was younger, her father, who was a psychology professor and really had like a hardcore study in dreams, went missing, and like no one ever found him. Just a lot of like speculation about what happened to him, and she's always just kind of lived in this shadow. So never really happy and just really angsty and mad at everyone, at the world completely. So one day she kind of crosses someone, and she's just a straight up bitch to this person. But lo and behold, this woman is a dream weaver, and she ends up sending our main character into this dream world. There are like 3 rules to this dream world. 1, the longer you stay in the dream world, the more likely you are to forget that you are not a part of it. 2, the longer you stay there, the more the dream will realize that you do not belong there, and it will try to kill you. And 3, there is only one way out, and you need to find it before you either forget yourself or get eaten. So this whole story would be like that these are really creepy things that are happening in this dream world, and she's trying not to lose herself or get eaten. And that is like what this novel is about. I do kind of have to play around still with fleshing out like the backstory for her father and why he disappeared, and how that will obviously relate to this whole dream idea. I do have some instances, but I'm going to have to do some research. Obviously, I think, I don't know if it goes without saying, but all of these are like adult fantasy at this point. The next story that I have is a dystopian sci-fi. And so this story actually started from a short story I wrote in college, where I had a teenage girl whose brain was altered, and it was making her do things like blacking out and stuff like that. But honestly, the story was a little bit weak, mostly because I think I needed to flesh it out more and make it longer. But 2, I didn't like that I said it as a teenage girl. So we came to like 6 years later, and I finally was like, I know what I want to do with this story. I have an Alter Army as like its working title. That is not staying because it's an ugly name, but that's what I'm using it right now. So that would be Project Alter Army. Basically, you have a main character who is suffering from PTSD, and she finds a flyer on the ground that says, you know, try our like clinical experiment. You'll be compensated, blah, 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 but we are working on trying to help change your triggers in your brain so that when you are having flashbacks or whatever they are, because it could be a couple different mental health disorders, but basically like their experiment is that it'll help you kind of like turn off those parts that are always triggering you. So she's like, okay, you know what? I'm so sick of this. So she decides to go into this experimental treatment. And she wakes up a year later and doesn't remember anything that happened to her in a year. The whole premise of this one would be that there is like, it's kind of like like I said, it's a dystopian world. So we're like later in America. They've kind of gotten rid of the term lengths. So it's, you no longer as a president have to stay for 4 years / run for 2 terms. Like as long as like the people keep voting you in, you stay the president at this point. So as you can probably imagine, this leads to some tricky things because there was such a wave of like growth and goodness from one president, And then the tides start turning where it ends up being a little bit more like a dictatorship, but people are not dissenting because every time someone is a dissenter to this like whole regime that's happening, they just disappear. And that kind of connects to what this clinical experiment was doing, because the clinical experiment, while it did kind of like change some of the mental health symptoms that people are experiencing, such as the PTSD triggers, it also warped them so that they would be able to kind of remote control-y put influences into their brain and make them assassins. So they have the government who is running these clinical trials on things that are actually changing people to be hitmen for, free. And that is why the government has been doing well, because now you have an entire world of people who are afraid of being a dissenter and disagreeing because all these people are going missing. So that is that story. Let's see. So the next one, this is one that I think, I'm not sure where I would want it to be. If it's going to be a YA fantasy or if it's going to be an adult fantasy. I don't know. But I've always had an idea about a vampire story. And I started writing this one for my first ever NaNoWriMo back in 2011. I started writing a vampire novel. I didn't get very far. I think I got like 6,000 words. And let me tell you, it was very reminiscent of the Twilight days. Like, yeah, it just needed to be done because we did not want to go back into those really, really bad tropes of the 2000s. So the only thing I know for sure about this novel is that there are going to be a female girl who is a human and is bitten by a vampire. And you have a male vampire who is trying to guide her. In my original iteration, it was going to be a love interest, but I don't know, like, I don't want the love story. It's not going to be a love story. It's going to be like them working together. And there may be a love story on the side. She is essentially going through a change. And with my vampires, the bite of a vampire, it could be lethal. So it's poisonous or it will help you. So you either accept the change or you reject it and you die. That one probably isn't too necessarily original because the House of Night books, which I loathe beyond loathing, that's also something they do. When you get marked, you either accept the mark or you die. But this is actually going to be a vampire bite and not like a fun tattoo. So that is kind of where she's in this position. So it's her trying to navigate something or another and understanding if she's going to die or not. I did kind of want her in college just because I do think it would be easier to be going through a vampire change in college or post-grad, because how are you supposed to hide that in high school? Honestly. So that's the only reason I'm not sure which age category it's going to be in. But I do have a really cool lore for the vampires, like that I want all creatures to be vampiric. So for instance, you have vampires that feed on blood, and creatures like you have succubuses who feed on energy. But in this world, they're just vampires. They're not really differentiated, because so you have the succubus who like feed on energy and like lust and desire. You have vampires who feed on blood. You have like fairies who would feed on like mischief and pain. So like you have these different things, and that's kind of how they're all like treated. And obviously you can turn into any one of them, but all of them have different risks for turning these into these creatures. And the vampiric world is kind of like a pocket world where there are little slips. Very similar, I guess this would be to the Cruel Prince series by Holly Black, where you can slip into this like different world and it's kind of like parallel to ours, but you have to know where the pockets are. And the different vampires, like the older you get, the more likely you are to lure people to you. So yeah, I don't really know much. Like I was gonna write this one a couple of times. Like I started and restarted this story so many times, but I'm at the point where I'm not really sure what age I want it, so I'm just kind of keeping it on the back burner. But I do eventually want to write my vampire story because I love vampires and I love a good vampire story, and I want to jump on this train one day. Now we're going to dive into a couple ideas that I had that really aren't in that genre. The first one is a thriller/horror, and that is inspired by a real life story that I know. you have this family. It's going to be in the point of view from a mom. So she has like her and her husband and her children move into this beautiful farmhouse. Like they worked so hard. So they move into it and they live on a street that's pretty much empty. Like you have miles and miles between like neighbors. However, the house that they move into is next to this decrepit falling down house where like no one's lived in for years, but it's somehow still standing. So they move into this place and, you know, like they kind of like make comments like, oh, it's such an eyesore to be there, but at least like we don't have any neighbors to worry about. And the main character, the wife, starts to see things like happening with this home. Like she swears like she sees people in it. She sees like this caretaker coming up and is kind of acting really strange, and just a lot of things like weird going on in this house. And she starts to kind of like try to investigate it, which eventually leads her to go into the house. And like it's almost like that weird parallel of like, you know, what is actually happening with this house. So I guess the closest would be a gothic thriller, or like a gothic horror novel. Like that's kind of what, like that suspension of disbelief, you know, what's true, what's not true. And I don't exactly know how I want to execute it yet, because obviously I'm going to have to like leave little things in. I do think I have a backstory for the main character, and that could be tied into the whole reason of why this may or may not be happening for real. And yeah, that's just kind of like the idea that I have. I don't know anything else. That is something that eventually I want to write one day. The second to last story that I have to share today is the closest thing that I think I will ever get to literary fiction, and it does have a fantasy element. It was a flash fiction piece that I wrote in college that I always wanted to flesh out more, and this is my project Grim Reaper. So essentially, my idea is that reapers in the world are individuals who essentially get tricked into reaping all the dead souls. And the only way that you can get out of this position is if you trick someone else to take your place. So our main character is at the side of her, you know, beloved partner. He is dying and she is grieving him before he actually goes because he's just so sick, and she would do anything to bring him back. And out of the corner of her eye, she sees what is a reaper. And the reaper is going to touch him and take his soul. And she is kind of like panicking, like, oh my God, I must be hallucinating. Like, I'm so delirious right now. When the reaper talks to her, and she tells my main character, you know, you can let him live, but you have to trade your life for his. She's like, well, you won't actually die necessarily, but you would become a reaper yourself. So you would take my place. And she decides to agree and take this deal, and she becomes a reaper, and her partner gets better miraculously and lives on. So what she comes to find out is that she can no longer speak to or talk with anyone of the living. She's very much invisible and very alone. So the entire story is very much her grappling with her mortality and loss and grief, as well as this idea of humanity, of, you know, if I wanted to get out of this deal, I have to trick someone else, but can I actually do that to a human? And as time progresses, that line between humanity and necessity start to blur. So it's her just kind of identifying if she could do this for the rest of her life because she doesn't want to condemn someone else, or if she's so miserable doing it that she will do anything to escape it. It is fantasy, but it's really just a character-driven story that I would love to explore. I do want to write that story one day. I think it would be a very personal story to me, so we'll see how it goes. But yeah, this one is more of a thriller fantasy. I had this entire idea. It's almost like a prompt, but like nothing prompted me. I was just sitting, like, I don't know, minding my own business, and this like idea was like smacked me across the face, and it's like, oh hey, what if we had a man going into a confessional to talk to a priest? This like man is telling all of these gruesome crimes that are happening before they happen, but then they do start to happen. So there's kind of like a whole play on, you know, who is causing these things to happen. Is there something more sinister happening? Is there a little bit something like a fantastical element? And you have this guy who is suffering from something or another and is trying to grapple with his own sanity and trying to figure out, like, am I actually doing this and hurting people? Or, you know, is it the priest who is listening to these ideas and like going out and enacting them? Or is there someone else that we don't know that's somehow being connected to these ideas? So again, have to flesh that bad boy out, but I love a good twisted tale, if you can't tell. All right, so then the one that I think is pretty much going to be young adult is Misfit Witches, which technically is being drafted, but this was a project that I was working on with two of my other friends, and me and one of the friends has written our chapters, and our third friend has not written anything, which is kind of why we just don't know where it is. But basically, it is a co-written tale following a couple different witches who all have powers that seem to be not working how they should. We kind of have all these different like witches who are broken in some way. They start to see things that are happening that aren't really lining up and are happening around the celebration that the town is supposed to be having. So they're kind of figuring out, you know, what's wrong with them as well as what's wrong with the town and how it all comes together. As I mentioned, while I could think it could be YA, our characters are varying age. I think we have like one as young as like 15, and then I think the other couple are in their mid-20s. So there's like, they're all kind of in that range. So I don't know really where it would land, but it's just a fun project that we wanted to start, and we got excited when we were talking about witches the one day, and we're like, what if we just had witches who just were bad witches and didn't know how to witch right? So that's kind of how it started, and I did have a lot of fun writing my chapter. So I do hope that we continue that project because I would love to see the conclusion myself. And the last one is in a genre it's a complete departure from all the fantasy stuff, and that is a contemporary romance. So my co-writer Caitlin and I, jokingly in a live stream, we're joking that we could make a story where we had two writers who were forced to write together, but then like, you know, go from hating each other to loving each other, and like we would just have fun with it. And we jokingly said that in a live stream, and then I really, really liked the idea. Our idea is for NaNoWriMo this year, we are going to draft a contemporary romance where we have two writers who are given a very strict deadline, and their publicists got together and said, you know, we're going to send you to a cabin. You guys are going to write the next best-selling romance novel together. And they hate each other. They don't know that they're writing with each other until they show up at this cabin and kind of realize they were bamboozled a little bit to writing with each other, and they have a deadline for whether, I don't know if it's going to be like a weekend or a week, but they have to give a first draft in by their deadline, and they have to figure out how to work together. So I'm really excited for that. I think it's going to be such a palate cleanser for me to write, especially if I do it this year. And I really love writing with my friend Caitlin. Like, I love the things that we've created together in the past, but mostly for the same story, but we've written a lot for that story. So I'm excited to actually see a different story that we can pull in a different genre, as well as the first time where we would be writing completely separate characters and not having any say over what they do. Because our other novel, we very much had a say in every single character. Like, the characters were never just one of us writing them. So this will be a new project for us to work on, and I'm excited. So anyway, that is like the end of my list that I currently have, and let me know down below what you guys think. What novel that I mentioned intrigues you the most? And yeah, that's it, guys. I post videos Tuesdays and Fridays and do some live streams here and there, usually about writing. And for the most part, I'm pretty chill. I love you to come hang out with me and stick around, so subscribe. Otherwise, I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.